over the four lobes, going over in this slide the demarcations, and then in subsequent slides we'll dive into each lobe separately. The frontal lobe is the easiest to understand where it begins and ends. But before we identify that, let's start with the starting point. When I first look at a brain, I look for two landmarks. One is the lateral fissure, and the other is the central sulcus. Of course, cerebellum, but that's a given. You just that has to orient you. But once you can identify the lateral fissure and the central sulcus, you can basically figure out where you are. The frontal lobe is a portion of the brain beginning at the lateral fissure and moving dorsally and caudally until the central sulcus. And this entire zone is frontal lobe. The parietal lobe begins at the central sulcus, but this time we're going caudally, right, and ventrally until kind of an imaginary line. The rule I use is you see the lateral fissure ends, but imagine it didn't. And just sort of mentally continue that. And this zone stretching from the central sulcus to that imaginary line that would exist if the lateral fissure never ended. This region is all the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe begins at that imaginary line that would exist if the lateral fissure never ended. And now why don't we draw a second imaginary line? Take that termination point and look right here where the cerebellum meets the cortex here and connect those. What you get is the occipital lobe. And finally, the rest is the temporal lobe. But let's not be lazy. Begin at the imaginary line that will be created if you connect the termination point of the lateral fissure with the point at which the cerebellum meets the cortex. Move. What direction is this? Rostrally or anteriorly? Sorry. And then ventrally until you hit the lateral fissure. And this is our temporal lobe.